All right. Thank you to everyone who is joining us. We have a couple of announcements as everyone joins. First, we are recording this session and it will be available in Whova, our conference app, within 2 weeks after the Congress ends. If you'd like to ask our speakers a question during this session, please use the Q&A area to the right of your screen. The chat window is where you can engage with other attendees. And we kindly ask that you keep your microphones and cameras off during the presentations and follow the presenter's lead on when to engage with cameras and microphones. It looks like we're ready to get started, so I'm going to hand it over to Alina to begin.
Hi folks, welcome to this special session on using high-resolution remote sensing to assess wildland fuels and fire effects. This is a three-part remote special session which runs through 2 blocks today and 1 block tomorrow morning. And at the end of the block tomorrow morning, we will have a full 40 minutes for discussion that we invite you to come back and join in with our session presenters. I'm going to kick off from there and let our first speaker, Kane, start his talk, and he's going to give an overview to get the session going.
Hello, now just do a quick check that my slide is showing.
Yes, it is.
Okay, so welcome to our special session. Thank you, Alina. My name is Kane. I'm with the University of Washington, and my goals today are twofold. One is to introduce the session, provide sort of a map to what kind of material is being presented. The talks are presented in particular order, so if you have a particular interest, you can know which block to look at. And then we realize that for many of the people who are watching this, some of the very basic methods are going to be discussed in the sessions may be new to you. So I'm going to provide a very brief and a very high level introduction to a couple of the key messages or key methods. So first of all, let's just look at the different blocks. This, of course, is block 2. This is the session we're in now. And our other than my talk, the unifying theme of the talks in this session are measuring surface fuels, using high resolution remote sensing to measure surface fuels. Then tomorrow in block 4, we actually have the talks covering a couple of different topics. One is how to tie what is measured in very high resolution remote sensing to fluid dynamic fire modeling. And then the second is connecting high resolution remote sensing to ecological fire and processing, so at a larger scale. And then block 5, again, also tomorrow, we have several talks, and we will have and these are unified by looking at landscape scale studies. Of course, all still related to fire or fuels. And I want to point out that there will be a group discussion starting tomorrow, going from 2 to 2:40, at which presenters will be available to discuss their questions or your questions. And I will put in a little plug for the presentations from mine in my sister labs here in the Precision Forestry Cooperative at University of Washington. We have a number of talks that are being presented both by people in my lab and also by Susan Pritchard and Monica Moscaz. And I would say the majority of these are here in this high resolution remote sensing session. However, there are some others, and please, of course, try to attend the poster session. So with that, let's look at high resolution remote sensing. Why is there now such a focus on using high resolution remote sensing to study forest and the effects of fire on forest and also the fuels within those forests? This, of course, is nothing new. We have been studying forests with remote sensing and the effects of fire for a long time, principally using satellite data with Landsat, I say, dominating that, the European Sentinel-2 satellites, which have similar but higher resolution capabilities, are also very prominent. And you can see here, for example, a burn severity map derived from Landsat data. However, there's two problems. One, most of these satellite data are measuring indirect correlates, i.e. spectral, multispectral images, rather than directly measuring attributes of the forests themselves. So there is a fidelity problem. And they tend to be moderate to coarse resolution. Landsat, for example, is 30-meter resolution. However, there are other widely used sensors such as MODIS, which go up to half a kilometer or a kilometer, depending on the wavelength. And of course, a great deal of information is lost at those resolutions. So there are many definitions that could be used for high definition. In going with the unifying theme of the talks in this session, I am going to apply a very practical one. In our context, high resolution remote sensing is the high precision measurement of the 3D structure of vegetation or fields. This will include its location, its shapes, and its volumes. And you can see several examples here from Yosemite National Park, taken from airborne LiDAR data, where we can visually see differences in forest structure that correspond with what we expect from burn severity. And these structures can be measured depending on the scale of the study and the instrument used at resolutions of millimeters to meters. And the scales of studies can range from plots or really even individual plants or trees to entire regions. So why do this? It's basically wildland fire is intimately connected to the physical structure, and that's what these 3D measurements measure. They measure the physical structure. There's not the information in this data, for example, to do species identification. Although our eyes can often identify the species, the algorithms to do this reliably from these types of data is still poor, although it can be combined with other data to get at species. But as I say, wildland fire is intimately connected to physical structure, whether it's the volume and arrangement of fuels prior to a burn or the changes to vegetation following a fire. And by using remote sensing, we can take measurements at scales that are simply impractical or in ways that are impractical. For example, trying to measure the detailed forest canopy structure is extremely difficult from the field with traditional field methods. With remote sensing, it is fairly straightforward to do. And of course, we can do this at scales that are impractical. Trying to do a 3D mapping of all fuels over a stand would be extremely laborious and really impractical using traditional field methods, but can certainly be done with some of the remote sensing methods that are going to be described in these sessions. And of course, with airborne data and now emerging satellite data, we can extend these studies to regions, states, and in many cases, whole nations have airborne LiDAR data. So what is studied? Many things can be, but I'm going to group the studies in this talk really into two broad categories. First, changes to vegetation post-fire. How did fire change the vegetation or the forest in an area? And again, this builds off of a long tradition of burn severity mapping with satellite data, for example, with Landsat. But now we can do it in much higher precision, much higher fidelity, much higher resolution. And there's two approaches here. Ideally, you have pre and post-fire high resolution data. When that's not available, a common technique is to look at what structures are present following the fire and compare them with nearby areas that were outside the fire perimeter, and then deduce likely changes. The other is fields mapping. With the methods that will be described here, we can do high resolution vertical and horizontal field mapping. And this can be used to guide risk assessments, plan treatments, and as some of the talks will talk about, now with the very high precision mapping of fuels, we can start to provide fuel data into a whole new generation of fire models. So I'm going to talk about two broad methods that are being used in these studies. The first is LiDAR. I expect most of you have at least a passing familiarity with LiDAR, but at its simplest, what it really is it's a laser rangefinder, which is used and swept back and forth to build up image over both X, Y, and Z coordinates. Of course, these are extremely high-tech instruments, both in the laser rangefinders and also in the supporting instrumentation that very precisely maps where the instrument is and exactly how it's pointing. And it can be used to map vegetation, fuels, or surfaces. And you can see an example over here. And any single point, any single return isn't going to tell you very much. But by analyzing the relationships of these returns together, we can learn a great deal about the structural fuels of fire. Two common methods are airborne, LiDAR carried in planes or uncrewed vehicles, terrestrial LiDAR on a tripod, and now there will be one talk in this session that uses spaceborne LiDAR. Another method, photogrammetry, sometimes more colloquially called structure from motion. This is actually a very ancient science or engineering topic. Goes back in theory over 150 years and practical uses over 100 years. And it's pretty simple. It uses overlapping images, as our eyes do, to build up a 3D image of the world. Multiple overlapping images, or at least two overlapping images, are taken. Software is used to find matching points in images, and it constructs a 3D model. And the result looks very much like a LiDAR point cloud. In general, these products have lower resolution than airborne LiDAR data, and they do have a limitation that they see only the tops of surfaces. So they're very good at mapping, for example, the top of a forest canopy, but they can't see through the little gaps like LiDAR does, where LiDAR is an active sensor where it is sending light down through the gaps, and so we can build up an image of what's below the top of surface. So a little bit on platforms and scales. If you want to measure individual trees or fuels at a very fine scale, or the structure of either over a plot, typical methods are going to be terrestrial LiDAR or handheld cameras. If you want to study structure over a stand or a project area, this could be a project area, for example, for a treatment. Typical method would be to use uncrewed aerial vehicles, and they may carry either LiDAR units or cameras, and those cameras will take those multiple overlapping images to enable photogrammetry. Then over landscapes, regions, whole countries, you would typically go with aircraft, and there you can use either LiDAR or something which is emerging. And there will be a talk on an example of this in these sessions. Photogrammetry derived from aerial images taken over very large areas. For example, the state I'm in, Washington State, has mapped all of its forest structure using data collected with the biennial NAEP program. And then there are satellites. Two of them are currently up, at least civilian that we know of. that use LiDAR. One is JEDI attached to the International Space Station, and the other is ISAT-2. And now I'm just going to give some examples of what these data look like. And here's an example by Jonathan Batchelor from the University of Washington. He will be presenting in these sessions. And this is terrestrial LiDAR. So this is a LiDAR unit on a tripod, scanning back and forth, up and down, and is building up this very high resolution 3D image. And we can see tremendous amounts of structure, both in the overstory. We could map the diameters of the trees, and we can certainly see shrubs and other fuels that are close to the ground. Also from Jonathan Batchelor, this is an example of data collected by different methods, different instruments from a study site at Fort Jackson in Southern California. Here, this is data from a terrestrial LiDAR unit, which would have been on the ground on the tripod, but Jonathan is projecting the information from above, and you can see the detail. And then we have two different examples of photogrammetry, one from a 12 megapixel red, green, blue camera, so a standard camera, and one from a much lower resolution, a multispectral instrument. And one of the things I want to emphasize here is not, when you talk about LiDAR or photogrammetry, not all products are created equal, and nor do you often need the same resolution depending on your goal. I talked about very large scale photogrammetry, and Saba Sabiri will be talking about an example of this. And here we have LiDAR over a section of Washington State. LiDAR is in the gold color. You can see detail along the ground. Clearly, we have probably a little stream running through the bottom of here with hill slope, and we can see some structure, and we can see the top of canopy. And then you can see the point cloud that was created from the imagery, which is used to create the nape imagery. And you can see it generally follows the top of canopy fairly well, but there are gaps, there are some outliers, but you would generally get to a similar interpretation. Then going at very fine scale, this is from a talk from Gina Cova, and in her research, she is using GoPros, handheld cameras, to do very fine scale mapping of ground fuels, and also then comparing those to terrestrial LiDAR models. So I will close off my talk now and take any questions. One thing I want to emphasize, this is a rapidly evolving field. You are seeing the cutting edge research in here, and it is going to continue to improve as instruments improve, as new software and statistical methods are developed, and as we find new ways to connect fire ecology and fire physics to this research. So I hope that you will watch many of these talks, and if there are any questions, I'll take them.
An excellent talk. Thank you for that introduction, Ben. I want to let everyone know that there's a number of ways you can ask questions. One of the simplest is within the Whova app. There's a Q&A question panel. There's also a chat panel, and I'll be checking both of those. And also, if you just want to unmute your mic and go ahead and ask, you can. So are there any questions? Wow. We've got one. We've got good introductions to the whole session. So we can also address big picture questions at the end tomorrow during our discussion section. So I'm going to go ahead and move us on to the next speaker, who will bring us in real close to field structure. So Eric Rowell, it's your turn to turn on your screen and share your presentation.
Okay. Is that the right one, Alina?
Yep, that looks right.
Okay. Well, yeah, Van, thank you for that introduction. And thank you, Alina. My name is Eric Roman, Assistant Research Professor at the Desert Research Institute. And today I'll be talking about how we're using terrestrial lasers to characterize understory fuel structure. There's an increasing history with characterizing fuels at fine scale. A lot of that drive came from things like RX Cadre. One of the early papers came from Kevin Hires et al. From the Southeast with a fuel cell concept that described variation in southern fuels at a 10 centimeter or less than a half meter scale, where fire came through and there was fire effects at that very fine scale that drove a variety of diversity and variability within the fuel layers. That was followed up by Louise Loudermilk in the late 2000s with some early work quantifying biomass and ultimately bulk density. And the reason that these were really important was because at the same time, fire behavior modeling was emerging into a new physics-based realm where there was coupled atmospheric and fire behavior modeling that now drove in a whole entire different realm that diverged greatly from what Rothermel had instituted in the early parts of fire behavior modeling. And that required some rethinking of how we chose to characterize fuels. So this has brought us to this new domain where we kind of reference it as 3D fuels or 3D forests, actually. We're collecting a lot of data using a bunch of, variety of techniques and sensors as Van described. One of the things that we've been looking at, is fuels are basically potential energy that's stored. Plants photosynthesize, they store it, and it's then they're waiting to either not burn or to burn. But there's a lot of factors that relate to how these fuels do burn, which are physical, environmental, and then some trait-based factors. Because of the way that fire behavior modeling came around with Rothermel, and then that led to things like land fire and just the standard 13 from Anderson and the 40 from Scott and Bergen. We generally treated fuels that as two-dimensional, and they were homogenized because the fire behavior models only had a limited way that they could actually process fire. And so we brought them all together, we congealed them into these kind of tidy little classifications that were then used in the models. But we know that fire acts on a variety of scales, and it's not just 2D, it's 3D. And then there's also a lot of factors in terms, you have prescribed fire, but then you also have wildland fire. Maybe an inversion sets up, or the plume comes over and shades out the fire. And because of that limitation of insulation, you start getting kind of the same, like lower fire effects. They aren't, the 90th percentile effects that we see with, big wind-driven events. And so there's this scaling factor where, we can work as fine as we possibly can. I work in a 10 centimeter voxel range when I'm doing my analysis, but, there's some range up into meters, and then maybe tens of meters, and then the 30 meter that we see with the standard land fire based off of what kind of fire we're expecting to see. So to kind of get into this, we've been playing around. The idea of the 3D fuels came about partly because we look at forest structure, and Russ Parson uses this term a lot, but the idea of lacunarity, kind of the absence of mass or absence of the gaps that allow the fluid flow of these fire behavior models or fire behavior to occur. So if you look at that, these are laser scans that we collected at several different sites. A is Annabella Reservoir, where FASME was. And what we see is, a blockage of fluid flow at the bottom, where we have kind of low values of horizontal advection, and maybe there's some vertical flow. But in this case, when they want to burn something like Annabella, they'll cut in alleys and lay fuel down so they can get some of that fluid flow to go through to carry the fire. And then the next one, B, is a mixed conifer forest in western Montana, And what we see is there's a lot of regeneration, some sparse canopy. So there's some good vertical mixing, and then there's some better horizontal advection. And finally is a southeastern site at Pebble Hill, where we have fire doing its process with these frequently burned pine forests. And you see the limbs rising up because the frequent fire and lots of gaps for flow to go through. And what this has led us to kind of look at is like, well, is this a scalable facet for as we look at surface fuels? Because basically it's kind of the Anderson porosity idea that fire is carried by gaps. And a lot of people have constantly used this kind of reference that fuels is not just as important about where fuels are, but it's also where fuels aren't. And so we've been playing around with this idea of fuel beds as a porous medium. And, you know, if you look on top of the A1, 2, and 3, what we have is just kind of a voxelized version of how fuels lay for long leaf regeneration, kind of a hardwood regeneration, and then you have one with hardwood regen with some woody. And what you see is that there's concentrations of mass, and they're not just only the bulk density of the mass, but they also have facets about what the fuel type are, because those fuel types are very critical to how fire propagates. And so you might have needles, you might have litter. In the fire behavior modeling realm, oftentimes, you know, they'll treat it as kind of plates and cylinders with, you know, needle cast being a cylinder, and it has different surface area to volume ratios or packing ratios that carry fire differently. And so these are the kinds of things that we ask ourselves and we start looking at as we start going forth and trying to look at how we can characterize fuels. And what's important about this is that it's not just fuels that are driving, it's, you know, the environmental, the physical characteristics. You know, in this slide here, what we have is on the left, we have a kind of what I'm calling a tight margin, which is that that's cycan, marsh, and then the kaibab, where we're burning in these margins like in the fall where sun angle is low. They're looking for precipitation to kind of dampen the effects to be able to control what they see and burn. And so what we have is, you know, a similar amount of fuels that we'd have on the right side, but they're regulated because there's fuel moisture, not the same kind of drying time that you would expect during the peak of summer in the southeast, which you might see in the middle there with some of the palmetto or the tall grass that are able to burn with more vigor. And then on the right is a spring burn in ponderosa pine, where it's after the thaw and there's a lot of solar insolation, and it's able to carry fire and do some group torching. And so these are the things that we look at as a factor of some elements that we want to eventually start characterizing beyond just bulk density. So the foundation of this work really comes at, you know, the framework that we had to start off with was characterizing bulk density. Some of the things that had always been a limitation had been that we collected fuels two-dimensionally. So in our 2018 paper, we introduced the idea of a 3D voxel sampling frame, where we're able to then place this frame over a fuel bed, and we're able to then sample in 10 centimeter strata with 25 subvoxels in it to get ideas of what are the dominant fuel types within each voxel. We do some subsampling to get variability of biomass, but then we are selectively cutting out each of the strata of biomass to then build what we see on the upper right, which is kind of a three-dimensional version of what we're sampling with lasers. And then we followed that up with an integration with terrestrial laser scanning to then validate whether or not we're able to improve how we collected fine scale fuels data. And so in this study, it launched kind of this 3D fuels element that we've been working on for the last 3 years, and using terrestrial laser scanning as the basis for how we're able to then go ahead and scan large units as well as localized units. And we used two lasers, a Regal VZ400i and a 2000. And these are time of flight lasers. And we have two modes of data collection that we use. One of them is the synoptic, which you can see right on the right-hand side, which is 25, 50-meter spaced scan positions where we're collecting information over a unit. And we're able to do this in about 2 hours. And then the second one is a more localized approach, which is what we're using as our parameterization, which is a 5 by 5 meter plot where we collect scans on 4 corners. And so our proof of concept began with the Prescribed Fire Consortium, and we had a couple of experimental burns in Pebble Hill, Georgia. And in this selection, it was a longleaf pine site that had been frequently burned every 1 to 2 years. And we introduced a new porosity metric, which was summarizing the amount of occupied volume at 1 centimeter, and then dividing that by a volume for a 10 centimeter cube to get an idea of how much was occupied within that. And at the same time, we also used a mesh algorithm to wrap a mesh around it to calculate surface area, because what we found was that porosity wasn't a great metric for shrubs, but it was a great metric for surface litter in the first 0 to 10 centimeters of information that we want to gather from the laser, which includes all the litter, some coarse woody. But more importantly, in the Southeast, and this holds true with many systems that are frequently burned, the vast majority of fuels were always clustered in the 0 to 10 centimeters. So it makes sense that the porosity metric, kind of after Anderson, would be a good metric to use. And what we found was that it was pretty well correlated, and we were able to predict the bulk density at the 0 to 10 centimeter really effectively using the porosity metric. And then using the mesh routine, we were able to then characterize for each strata what the additional mass was per strata, to then summarize that and total it into a total mass. And so we had tested this at the Pebble Hill, and our first replicate was the Blackwater State Forest in Florida. And this site was part of a Fire XAQ with NASA, where they had a plane flying over to sample the species and volumes of smoke. And we went out and collected these data, and it was a synonymous site to what we saw in Pebble Hill in many respects. It was longleaf dominated, frequently burned with needlecast wiregrass, and it had a distinct shrub layer that was more pronounced than what we had seen in other places. And so with this, we were able to then replicate this. It was not as effective, and part of the reason was because we moved from a mode with the Pebble Hill where we were scanning 3 positions on each of the clip plots to the method I described in the beginning of this, with the 4 corners being scanned. But nonetheless, we were still able to effectively predict out both the litter bulk density, grass bulk density, as well as shrub bulk density. And this led then to where we've been working to apply this to other sites. On the big site of the United States, this is the distribution of Western and Eastern sites that we've been sampling to start building a library of fuels, predominantly looking at ponderous pine systems in the West, and then a mixture of longleaf and loblolly in the East. And we're just beginning to get into the secondary analysis where we apply the models. One interesting factor that we found was that, porosity doesn't seem to be ubiquitous in every system. And we've been playing around with using the surface area calculation in the 0 to 10 centimeter to also kind of build out secondary models. But ultimately, we're looking to settle in on what the combination of models are to be able to accurately quantify what we see in terms of not just the surface fuels in the 0 to 10 centimeter, but also the shrub fuels. So our next steps are to take some of the things that you'll see in upcoming presentations, and then what I've just presented, but using the local TLS and then the GoPro based photogrammetry to start training coarser data. So If we start feeding in our 5x5 estimates, which are high resolution at 10 centimeter voxels, but we summarize them up to half meter by half meter bin. And then we can apply that to the synoptic photogrammetry as well as TLS, and then start training up even to coarser with ALS data, NAPE imagery, and other user-based polygons that might represent stands. Additionally, we've been playing around with this conceptual model of whether or not fire and fuels are plant-driven or fire-driven. And what you'll see in other presentations, like with Gina Cova and her photogrammetry, is that TLS is expensive. It's hard to come by. There's other presentations that you'll see in this conference using the Leica BLK, where it brings the cost down. But what we'd like to do is start getting large amounts of data using the GoPro, so we can use those as labels for artificial intelligence. We also want to get into understanding dynamics of fuel moisture, which Jonathan Batchelor will talk about, but also integrate these with ALS and UAS-based photogrammetry, so we can start answering aspects about what traits are driving fire, what environmental conditions are driving fire, as well as the physical elements. And with that, thank you.
Okay, folks, we have time for some questions. Does anyone have any follow-up questions for Eric? You can type them in the question and answer chat in Whova, or just go ahead and unmute and ask. Okay, then I'll give you a question, Eric.
Okay.
Just to keep, everyone's been kind of quiet this morning. I think we still need some coffee or to get into the role of virtual meetings. First off, you've got a whole lot of different, you had like a whole list of variables you could calculate from the scanning data. And what's the difference between lacunarity and porosity?
Right. So yeah, lacunarity comes from fractal science, and it's really these big gaps. So I think the way I like to describe it is that lacunarity in terms of the areas between crowns are these, it works on a similar idea that it's these big gaps, but porosity, I like to think of it as a sponge. You're looking at very compact, like if you think about soil porosity and those very small, fine gaps that occur that allow water to percolate through. And lacunarity in this case is much larger gaps, and it can be gaps within the bulk density within branchlets, but also can be these big areas between the boles of trees and the base of canopy, which are huge drivers in terms of fluid flow that drives fire behavior in these systems.
Okay. And I'm just looking over here. It looks like we have a question in the chat from Scott Ritter. Great talk. I'm interested in your ability to determine litter bulk density. I'm hoping you can talk more about this, especially in the context of infrequent fire and deeper, higher bulk density litter.
Yeah, well, so the first thing is that we don't penetrate the surface. So things like duff and those facets will have to be imputed or quantified in a different way. But when it comes to the litter bulk density, what we've found is that the resolution of the data that we have with the LiDAR is picking up a lot of the micro topography, and especially when you start getting areas where there's gaps. And by normalizing it, and basically what we have is probably like 5 centimeter relief that is driving the porosity that helps us see that litter bulk density estimate work. What we've also seen though is as we get more shrub dominated or denser systems, that model begins to fall apart because our penetration through those shrubs is very limited. And so in terms of frequently burned pine systems, this method has been really effective. As we go into other elements, what we'll more than likely have to do is start building relationships with what's happening above to start driving those models.
Excellent. Well, we're at 1:39, so I think it's time to switch over to Gina Cova's talk, which will follow up nicely on this one, which uses another type of sensor to look at 3D field structure. So Gina, go ahead and set up your talk.
right, let's see.
And for those of you in attendance, if you just came in the room, remember you can type questions into the Q&A within Whova, and we'll try to get to them after the end of the talk. Great. Go ahead.
All right, does that look all right?
Looks good.
Great. All right, well, hi folks. My name is Gina Cova, and I'm a graduate student at the University of Washington School of Environmental and Forest Sciences in the Forest Resilience Lab and Precision Forestry Cooperative. And today I'm going to tell you a little bit about a project I've been working on with Susan Pritchard and Eric. And Eric and Van have already done a pretty good job of introducing this project to assess a novel technique to remotely sense understory fuels. Here we go. So specifically, I'm interested to see if there's an affordable, accessible way that forest and fire managers might be able to learn about the structure and amount of understory fuel present on the lands that they manage. As Eric kind of already introduced, this is obviously important for a variety of reasons. Just to give a few examples, quantifying the structure and biomass of understory fuels is important for fuel management and prescribed burn planning. And 3D characterizations of fuels are really critical for linking vegetation to fire effects and informing the next generation of fire modeling. The reality is that there are a lot of barriers to getting this fine scale quality information on structure and biomass. Of course, the most direct approach is to walk outside and just start field sampling. But this is obviously very time and labor intensive, and methods to streamline this sampling, like Brown's transects or point intercept sampling, are really done at the sacrifice of wall-to-wall information. And are really just abstractions of what's actually happening on the ground. Remote sensing, specifically terrestrial LiDAR scanning, which we've already heard about, is really kind of the gold standard for rapid, high-resolution 3D data collection for sub-canopy fuels. TLS point clouds representing vegetation can be segmented and analyzed for characteristics that we've already heard about, like volume and surface area and fuel height. And when paired with field sampling, can be used to develop those predictive models of biomass. However, a terrestrial LiDAR scanner can be fairly cost prohibitive. An instrument typically runs in the thousands of dollars, with some models costing upwards of $100,000. And even if you've got a device in hand, they aren't necessarily intuitive or convenient or efficient to operate for someone, for managers or someone without that specific training. But photogrammetry, also called structure from motion or structure from motion photogrammetry, has shown promise as a more affordable, more accessible method of generating these 3D point cloud models that can be segmented and analyzed in similar ways to TLS. If you're unfamiliar with photogrammetry, it's essentially a process where multiple overlapping photos taken from different viewpoints of the same object or area of interest are kind of stitched together to form a 3D scene represented as a point cloud. Like Van mentioned previously, photogrammetry has been around for quite a while, and there's been work that explores its utility at many different scales, from aerial photogrammetry to really close range photogrammetry. And in this project, we were really interested to see if and how we could analyze point clouds from close range photogrammetry to predict configurations and amount of fuels on the ground, which could provide this reliable alternative to TLS. So this project evaluates photogrammetry collected at 2 different sites across the US, Lubricht Experimental Forest in Western Montana and Tate's Hell State Forest in the Southeast in Florida. At each of these sites, we set up around 40 square plots. These plots were a ½ meter by a ½ meter on each side. And for each plot, we generated a photogrammetry model, but we also inventoried fuels within each plot and then destructively sampled for biomass. Both of our sites were these open pine overstories, as you can see in the photos on the right. That's Lubricht at the top and Tate's Hell on the bottom. But they had fairly different understories. So Lubricht is really more grass and timber litter dominated, while Tate's Hell is really dominated by these large shrubs. So it was also kind of a cool opportunity to compare how this close range photogrammetry performs in different forest and different vegetation types. Hopefully this works. So I want to walk you through the process of how our photogrammetry models are actually created. We wanted to develop a consistent framework that was as automated as possible, so that other folks in the future could potentially try this process themselves. So like I already mentioned, we use a GoPro camera. They run a couple $100 each to record video over each of our plots at Lubrecht and Tate's Hell for a total of 79 plots across both of our sites. The process of collecting the video is pretty simple. This is an example of what one of those videos actually looks like, and apologies if it's a little laggy. It is a normal video on my end. But essentially, we hold the camera at a level plane above the vegetation, and we slowly make these sweeping motions to record everything in the plot below. And if you can, notice that in the corners of the video, you can often see other sampling frames from other plots, which is pretty key in generating these final photogrammetry models, because they're kind of these distinct objects that help tie the final frames together. After that video is collected, again, that video is super short, just 1 to 2 minutes long. We run everything through a Python script that parses it down into around 400 still frames per plot. And this is obviously just a small subsample of the frames here. But the point is that there's a tremendous amount of overlap between these different stills, which is really important for generating a good final model. And after we have those stills, we run even more Python scripts through a software called Agisoft Metashape, which identifies those tie points I was talking about earlier, which are just typically corners of those red and white sampling frames, to stitch together a complete model. And what you're looking at here is the full model generated from that same video that I showed earlier. This is just a plot at our Tate's Hell site in Florida. If you look really closely, you can see a handful of the sampling frames within this model. Or if you can't see the frames themselves, you can at least hopefully see the metal poles we attached to each of them. It's a little hard to see the exact frames because this is an oblique view, but you can rotate this model around and you can see them pretty clearly at other angles. So the goal of this work is, of course, to relate these models back to the field inventory and destructively sampled data, which we only have for the vegetation within these frames. So the last step in generating these models is to clip them down. We do this in Cloud Compare, which is just an open source, freely available point cloud manipulation and analysis software. Eric already introduced this a little bit, but I want to talk a little bit more about how we inventory fuels during our field sampling, because it's also helpful for thinking about how we work with these photogrammetry point clouds. So at each of our plots, we collect presence and absence information for fuels at this voxel level. And voxels are essentially just 3D pixels. So for example, if we look at this plot in the top photo here, it's a little hard to see with this top-down view, but what we've got are some needles and smaller vegetation on the ground. And then if you can see, a shrub cuts across the plot, maybe a ½ meter above the ground. And if you can imagine taking this plot and you drape a grid of cubes over it, for each of those cubes or voxels, we mark whether or not there's fuel inside of it. So what this plot really looks like from kind of a voxelized perspective is what you see on the right here, where each of these black cubes represents an empty voxel for this plot, and each green cube is an occupied voxel. A really shrubby plot with a higher volume of occupied voxels might look like these two photos on the bottom here. So we did this process for all 79 plots across our study sites. So what we have in addition to biomass data is this rich information on occupied voxels that we can use to derive things like fuel volume and fuel height as they exist in the field within each of our plots. We do a similar process with the photogrammetry data. Because we can't really analyze the raw point clouds in our models, we have to summarize them in some way. And the way that we do that is by voxelizing the data. So similarly to our field data, we can calculate metrics like occupied volume and fuel height within our point clouds and see not only if any of those metrics have a relationship to biomass, but how those metrics compare directly to metrics calculated in the field from that voxel data. And the metrics we'll look at today are surface area, fuel height, and occupied volume of our photogrammetry plots. So the first metric we explored to summarize our photogrammetry data was surface area. We were not only interested to see if the surface area of our models could be used to predict biomass, but we were also interested in identifying the best method of calculating surface area. So we tested a few different approaches to calculating this metric. We tested a convex hull approach, which essentially takes a point cloud and kind of interpolates the shell around it, and a kernel density approach, which generates surface area by computing a three-dimensional kernel density estimate. Within the kernel density approach, as you can see here, we tested a rougher approach, which yielded a kind of a more pixelated surface area that you can see in the middle image, and a smoother approach, which yielded a much higher resolution rendering of the photogrammetry surface area. And these three images all represent that original photogrammetry cloud that you can see on the left. So we tested these three different surface area calculations on only our plots first just containing shrubs across both of our sites. And what we found was that our convex hull approach, despite looking much more generalized than the kernel density approaches, actually had way stronger relationships to biomass across both of our sites in plots containing shrubs. You can see some of those results on the right here, which compares just the convex hull surface area approach to the smoothed kernel density approach in predicting biomass for those shrub plots in Tate's Hell only, although we saw similar results at our Lubric site. And these results seem somewhat surprising when you consider how much more the kernel density surface area looks like the actual vegetation in the plot. But it's important to consider that the GoPro photogrammetry in general may be producing somewhat sparser point clouds than what you might see with something like TLS. And therefore, surface area for these plots might be underestimated and maybe more variable than what's happening in reality. So the convex hull might actually be compensating for some of that. When we test this convex hull surface area approach on all of our plots, we find that generally surface area is a better predictor of biomass in our Tate's Hell, Florida site, which is on the whole more dominated by shrubs. At Lubrecht, which is our timber litter dominated site in Montana, surface area doesn't perform as well in biomass predictions. At Lubrecht, we do have plots containing shrubs, but we also have a lot more plots with woody debris. So we may have plots with higher biomass, but lower surface area, like the plot shown here, which would weaken that overall relationship of surface area to biomass for the whole site. We also looked at the average height of each of our photogrammetry models and how that related to biomass. Similar to surface area, height was a better predictor of biomass at Tate's Hell than at timber litter dominated Lubrecht. For both sites, however, height is a slightly better predictor of biomass than surface area for our models. And the final metric that we evaluated was occupied volume. So if you remember those voxel visualizations from earlier, where each black voxel was unoccupied and each green voxel was occupied with fuels, occupied volume is just a super simple calculation of occupied voxels divided by total number of available voxels. And when we look at that relationship to biomass for the two sites, we actually see a different pattern than what we saw with surface area and height, which is that occupied volume is a better predictor of biomass in Lubrecht, that western site, than at Tate's Hell. And one explanation for this could be that there's more or potentially more variable occlusion for plots with large shrubs and dense vegetation like you see at the bottom here, which occur much more frequently in our Tate's Hell site. So Van already kind of mentioned this in the first talk, but photogrammetry is really good at capturing the top or the outer hull of vegetation, but where the camera can't actually see something, it can't generate points for. So in really dense plots where you can only really see the outer edges or that outer hull of vegetation, you'll get a reduced occupied volume, even though there's quite a bit of biomass there. Of course, we're interested in how these metrics can be used to predict biomass, but we're also interested in how these metrics compare to the same metrics calculated in the field with our voxelized fuel inventory data. We first looked at the heights for each of our plots, comparing the heights calculated from our photogrammetry data with the field data. So in the graph here, each of these bars represents a single plot, where the blue bars are the heights according to the field sample data, and the red bars, which they're just purple where they completely overlap with the blue bars, are the heights according to the photogrammetry models. And so interestingly, what we found, at least so far, is that the photogrammetry heights are quite closely correlated to the field sampled heights. But as you can see, kind of across the board, the photogrammetry heights are consistently lower. And this happened for both Lubrecht, that timber litter dominated Montana site, and Tate's Hell, our shrub dominated site in Florida. It's a similar story when we compare photogrammetry derived occupied volume with occupied volume calculated from our field sampling data. Again, they're decently correlated with one another, but estimates of occupied volume in the photogrammetry models are consistently lower than the field data. And again, this happens at both Lubrecht and at Tate's Hell. For both fuel height and occupied volume, we're likely seeing this for two primary reasons. First, as I've kind of previously mentioned, the photogrammetry produces sparser point clouds and can have a high potential for occlusion, which would result in both shorter heights and lower occupied volume in certain plots. And second, the very nature of kind of our voxelized sampling in the field could also potentially result in overestimations of height and occupied volume. For example, if we consider those previous kind of voxel visualizations I showed earlier, you might consider a scenario where a thin branch crosses into a voxel. And so we say that, yes, this voxel is occupied, but when we calculate volume from that, we're taking that thin, not super voluminous branch and aggregating it up to the scale of the voxel. This is still an ongoing project, so we're also looking into ways that we might adjust how we calculate height or occupied volume in our photogrammetry data to reduce kind of the disparities we see here and make sure that we're actually capturing this information accurately. So to summarize this work, we evaluated GoPro-derived photogrammetric models in a western ponderosa pine and a southeastern pine forest to see if this affordable, accessible method of data collection could be used to predict biomass and structure of understory fuels. And what we found so far is that surface area and fuel height calculated from our models was a better predictor of biomass in our shrubbier understories, like those we saw in our Tate's Hell, Florida site. And so far, occupied volume has been a better predictor of biomass in these timber litter dominated understories, like those we see in our Lubrecht site in Western Montana. Thanks so much. I'm happy to take any questions.
Gina, excellent talk. I've got a question in the chat for you, which
Sure.
I think is an interesting one from Matt Dickinson. How do you envision using the color that's provided by photogrammetry versus LiDAR?
That is such a great question because we have started thinking about that as a next step. And you know, there's a couple different ways I could see it working. One that Eric has already talked about is integrating the photogrammetry and the TLS and treating it as a single point cloud and seeing if you can use that original RGB information, because I should say that, you know, when we're actually working with this data, each of those points in the point cloud is attributed with a red, green, and a blue value. So there's a lot of potential there to stitch that together with the TLS and say, like, can we look at porosity and an average red value or an average green value and try to get at, you know, fuel status, live or dead, or fuel type, is this shrub, is this litter? I also think there's a potential to use just the photogrammetry if you're not stitching it together with TLS to kind of do a similar approach where, you know, you're looking at those average color values and trying to say, like, is this a shrub? Is this litter? We do have that information also with the field data that we've collected. So there's a lot of cool opportunity there.
Could you differentiate, just to follow up on this question, can you differentiate stems versus leaves using that color data, for example?
Potentially, depending on the forest type and the vegetation type. I would say that the biggest challenge to that is kind of what I was showing earlier with at least the saw palmetto shrubs in the southeast, is you get kind of this occlusion where you might just end up with mostly leaves, kind of depending on the architecture of the shrub.
Excellent. If anyone else has any other questions, we have time for one more.
I have a question.
Sure.
So with photogrammetry, a lot of the initial processing impacts like the final point clouds, like how much Did you notice that? What are your thoughts about on that initial processing and the final relationships you're finding?
Yeah, that's a great question because we wanted this process to be as automated as possible so that it could be a process that people could actually use. But when we kind of took the most automated approach at the beginning, I'm trying to remember because it was a long time ago now, but the photogrammetry models were not really true. They didn't have the correct scale. And so it did take some manual going back and doing a little bit of manual attribution to, open up Agisoft and say, okay, this length of this plot is 0.5 meter and the length of this plot is 0.5 meter. And now train off of that information so that you don't end up with plots that are way too small or way too big. So, in an ideal world, we could add some markers. If we could go back, we would add some markers to, automate that process better. But yeah, it did take a little bit of manual attribution kind of post-processing to make sure it was completely accurate in size.
Excellent. We're going to have to switch to Michelle Bessler. I realize there's also some questions in the chat that we haven't gotten to, and we will bring those up in our discussion section tomorrow after the last session. All right. Thank you, Gina.
All right.
Michelle's going to get us started on linking this to other traits.
All right, hi everyone. My name is Michelle Bester, and I'll be sharing with you also some of the research that I'm doing and currently working as part of my dissertation. This is assessing LiDAR-derived shrub architecture and linking it to the traits of flammability. So I'm going down to shrub level. We've looked at plot level now, so I'm going all the way down to a single shrub. So just to outline, I'll just introduce and give an overview of my topic. I'll briefly outline the research objectives. I'll share some of the methods and results thus far. This is still an ongoing project, so I'm still currently working on this, and also highlight some of the project significance. So why shrubs? Shrubs comprise a major portion of the biodiversity in many terrestrial biomes, especially forested ecosystems. They act as ladder fuels, which could lead to stand replacing fires. They provide food and shelter for much of our wildlife and play a central role in maintaining ecosystem functions. Their structural characteristics influence nutrient cycling, forest hydrology, facilitate succession, and support seedling regeneration. Shrub architecture also significantly influences fire behavior, which is obviously of particular interest in this study. Just a quick overview. Our study looks at flammability based on characteristics that influence fire probability and behavior. These are determined by 4 components: ignitability, which here represents how easily the plant can catch fire; combustibility, which is a measure of intensity and the speed at which the plant can burn; consumability is related to how much of the plant is burned, as well as sustainability, which is the amount of time or the time taken for this plant to burn. We are interested in the physical drivers influencing flammability, in which these drivers enhance or decrease flammability of shrubs. For the study, we focus on the physical mechanisms of vegetation structure, so not the chemicals per se, and then how these influence flammability, such as the clustering and distribution of branches and leaves. To do this, we will be using LiDAR, so terrestrial LiDAR. This is just a remote sensing technique that Van and Eric and even Gina has explained, so I'm not going to go into much detail about this. But basically, for this study, I use a TLS, which is a ground-based LiDAR scanner used to capture shrubs in the study, and it creates these point clouds that Gina spoke about. So from these point clouds, we can create these quantitative structure models. These can be used to extract various architectural traits. These are simply 3-dimensional reconstructions of the objects, in our case shrubs, from the point cloud data. They use geometric primitives, often cylinders, that are fitted to these point clouds to create these models. The models or the scripts that we are using, the algorithms, are optimized and modified from existing algorithms that are available freely. And these models are often refined for trees. So we're trying to test and optimize them for shrubs. So our first research objective is to determine whether QSM, these quantitative structure models, can be derived from the LiDAR data for shrubs specifically, and how accurately we can calculate and extract architectural traits from them, which then leads to our second research objective, which is a multi-step objective to see how species vary in flammability based on these certain flammability components, and then link these back to the QSM-based traits. So before doing this in the field, and partially due to COVID, we decided to investigate the QSM for 10 architecturally different shrubs from a nursery. To assess the performance of the QSM, we chose shrubs with different heights, complexities, branching patterns, and crown shape for the study. The initial test was to see how well the QSM could delineate the stems. So my undergrad assistants and I had the tedious job of actually removing all the little leaves from the shrubs before scanning them. And we also manually recorded each of the shrubs' different measurements, such as height, branching order, and then using this color-coded unique branch ID system, seen here in the bottom right-hand corner, we also recorded the lengths and diameters for all the shrubs. We scanned the shrubs at high resolution as well as low resolution to determine how much of a difference this would make when creating these QSM models. And then we also computed multiple reconstructions of these models using different parameters to see what would work out best. These models were then compared to the manual measurements as well as the point cloud to determine accuracy assessment. So various accuracy assessment matrices were run to determine how well the QSMs modeled the shrubs. And I will just outline a few of these accuracy assessment results. A regression analysis between the measured heights and the heights extracted from the various QSM models all had high R-squared values. This suggests that these models can accurately predict heights from the various shrubs. Looking at branch detection, the percentage of all the branches detected across all the shrubs by the QSM for the low resolution LiDAR was nearly 57% here in the green. And then for the high resolution LiDAR data was much higher at nearly 83% shown in the blue. However, when calculating the detected branches that were larger than 2 millimeters in diameter, the percentages for both the low and high resolution QSM increased significantly, with almost all the branches detected for the high resolution QSM. With less architecturally complex shrubs, shown here on the left with sparse vegetation and lower branching orders, we can see that diameters are predicted rather well using the QSM and having a high R-squared of 0.96. However, regression results do tend to be lower for denser shrubs with more complex structures, as seen here for this viburnum shrub on the right-hand side. Here is just a few examples of our QSM reconstructions of the various shrubs. Here you can visually see how the QSMs did well for the sparse shrubs, but had some trouble delineating the more dense shrubs. This helped us come up with a few strategies of how to better proceed for denser shrubs when looking at our second portion of our study in the field. We also noticed that the size and clustering of branches, the number of stems, as well as the growth form have an influence on the QSM accuracy. And I'm currently writing this to include these in my results. But overall, we found that, the QSM do model these shrubs accurately. So we got an idea of what to do and what not to do, and off to the field we went. So this led to our second portion of our study using actual field data. For the study, we were interested in understory shrubs in the pine forest ecosystems in southeastern parts of the US. These areas are characterized by low intensity surface fires. They are adapted to fire, and are one of the most diverse plant communities, which have habitat to numerous endemic plant species, as well as wildlife species, such as the red-cockaded woodpecker and the gopher tortoise. So my study falls within the pine flatwoods, which are dominated by either slash or longleaf pine overstory, with this dense short shrub understory. The common understory species here is the saw palmetto, gallberry, tarflower, as well as some other flammable evergreen shrubs. The study sites include Tate's Howell State Forest, THSF, as we heard from Gina, as well as the Osceola Wildlife Management Area, AWMA, indicated here on the red points on the map. And here we are currently in the process of creating these QSM, these models for our field data. And once the QSMs are modeled, the second objective is then to link these traits that are derived from the QSM to flammability. I am busy calculating and extracting a number of these traits, but here are just a few to summarize, or what we think would be the most important. So volume, crown density, which is how densely packed the canopy of the shrub is. Also, this could pertain to sustainability and consumability, flammability components. Then canopy porosity, which is how much open spaces are situated throughout the canopy, which is possibly linked to all the flammability components. Crown vertical kurtosis, which is the vertical distribution of foliage and branching of shrub, as well as surface area to volume ratios. Here again is just an example of a shrub from Tate's Howell, from the point cloud all the way to the QSM model, as well as some of the parameters we can extract from the QSM. These include volume per diameter class, volume per branching order, as well as the number of branches in each of the branching orders. So far, we've only looked at the QSM of the woody structure. So what about the leaves? So the foliage obviously does contribute to the overall structure as well as influences flammability. Therefore, using a method implemented by Ackerboom et al.'s research using an open source MATLAB script called QSM Fanny, which stands for Foliage and Needle Naive Insertion Algorithm. These use leaf models that are defined geometries based with triangles. And these geometries is all the same for all the leaves without the shrub, but can be scaled, rotated, translated during this generation process. This basically means that the leaves are all the same shape, but the size and the orientation may vary, and the clustering may vary across the shrub itself. This method still does need some improvement, so we're looking at how to improve this, but it serves as a good base for this project. And then to link the QSM architectural traits to flammability, we actually also need to do some flammability traits. So we are using existing data, flammability data from shrubs in the Southeast, from numerous researchers, as well as lab experiments. And we also conducted our own field burns to obtain flammability traits. The controlled burns were conducted at Tall Timbers, Florida, where we tried to mimic the infield conditions as close as possible, including the litter depth and the fuel surrounding the shrub. So it wasn't just a single shrub, but also the build-up of how the surrounding shrubs looked. And we also looked at shrubs that were clustered or shrubs that were individually grown by itself. So we looked at different parameters. And then we had sensors and cameras set up to capture various flammability traits. Some of these traits include like the maximum flame length, flaming duration, radiative flux density, as well as time to ignition. And then to assess the mechanistic drivers of flammability, we will be using exploratory data analysis approach. Since the response variables are highly correlated and there's an inherent multicollinearity of architectural traits, we will make use of principal component analysis. Regression analysis will also be employed to analyze the relationships then between the principal components and the flammability of the principal components of the flammability traits, as well as the QSM derived traits. We will then evaluate the effects of categorical variables, such as the growth form, using a cluster analysis. And the overall goal here is to determine the best predictors of flammability and then to create this trait-based flammability index that can be attributed to the QSM models itself. And then just to end off, I just want to highlight the importance of this research. So it's the so what factor. Why am I doing this? Well, firstly, it will allow us to accurately create these 3D models of shrubs and extract parameters without destructively sampling. This research will also expand our knowledge on how vegetation architecture affects flammability of understory species in the Southeast. My research also has broader impacts as it forms part of this larger SERDP 3D fuels project. And since the data sets collected, of my individual shrub form part of these larger data sets that Gina and Eric and everyone else is collecting, there's this possibility of scaling up and using that in future studies. And the QSM methodology can also be adopted for shrubs in other ecosystems. It's not just for the Southeast. And the results are also not limited to just fire ecology, but can also be implemented in other 3D modeling, forestry, and ecology applications, and be incorporated into developing or updating existing fire models. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Michelle. That was excellent. Does anyone have any questions for Michelle? You can unmute and go ahead and ask them or type them into the chat. Okay.
This is Susan. I had a question. So, and I can start my video too, so it's easier. Really excellent job, Michelle. I just wanted to hear a little bit about your flammability experiments and if you noticed some of the plant traits and how they contributed to flammability. What were some of the trends you saw with your experiments?
Yes. We still in the very preliminary data analysis part of that, but currently found that open structure actually it was more flammable in this case because it would just burn very easily and the wind would just go through it. And then also the type of fuel, if it was very densely packed, in that case, it also had an influence. So it just depended on the arrangement of branching pattern. Really, then the height didn't really have that much of an influence so far. But the structure of the vegetation itself, the branching patterns seemed to have and the growth form, like how clustered it was versus how open space it was, definitely influenced the fire.
Excellent. One other question just to follow up. What about the actual flammability of the leaves? Did you have a sense for evergreen versus deciduous leaves?
I have that recorded, but I haven't really done analysis on that yet. So I do have that data and we can definitely look into it and see how it would affect flammability. I'm sure there is going to be this traits or this relationship between the flammability, but I haven't done that yet.
Well, again, thank you. Excellent job.
I have a follow-up question just in terms of the plant leaves. Do you know how well the triangular model matches up with like actual surface area leaf data? Is it a good approximation?
So far, yes. We've scanned like 100. We took a sample of about 100 leaves per shrub, if they had so many, and just to see how it correlates. And then the triangles can be up to as many triangles as you wish. So if you have, it's not just one triangle, you could make it into 3 or 4 triangles that make up the shape of the leaf. So you're trying to get it as close as possible. It's not perfect, but it's definitely, like I said, it's a starting point.
Excellent. Thanks, Michelle. We're going to move on to our last talk for this block, which will be Jonathan Batchelor, who's going to move us into remote sensing with LiDAR in order to determine something that's temporally dynamic, fuel moisture. Oh, we're having trouble hearing that.
Hello, my name is Jonathan Batchelor, and I am a PhD student in the Remote Sensing and Geospatial Analysis Lab at University of Washington. Today I'll be talking about our experiment to use terrestrial laser scanning for fuel moisture characterization. So why fuel moisture? Well, very broadly speaking, of course, wet things don't burn as well as dry things. Small changes in fuel moisture can impact things like the ignition, behavior, and the ability to control fire. The small gradients in fuel moisture and changes in fuel moisture are a major consideration when prescribed fires happen. And there's a long history of remote sensing being used to detect the fuel moisture level and fuel moisture gradients across small areas or landscapes. A lot of the remote sensing techniques used to describe moisture across an area use the fact that in the near infrared section of the electromagnetic spectrum, around 1400 to 1600 nanometers, the energy is greatly absorbed by water. Here's a conceptual diagram of dead plant material where showing the saturated dead plant material is highly absorbent of the energy in that section, whereas as the material dries, more and more energy is reflected. And the important thing to note here is that width of difference is much greater at around 1500 nanometers, 1400 nanometers than lower in the lower wavelengths. Indices such as the Global Vegetation Moisture Index use this relationship to create index to have large-scale moisture maps across large areas. On a little more local level, there have been recent advances using shortwave infrared cameras mounted on drones to map moisture gradients across small localized areas. So for this study, we had a whole host of questions that we wanted to ask. Is there a relationship between the spectral reflectance at 1550 nanometers as measured by a spectrometer and moisture content of a material? Given that near infrared is absorbed by water, is there a relationship between fuel moisture and LiDAR intensity returns? Is there a difference in the relationship detected depending on if a time of flight or a phase shift LiDAR unit is used? Does the distance and angle of the LiDAR pulse relative to the sample change the relationship between LiDAR intensity and fuel moisture? And does the type of fuel change that relationship between LiDAR intensity and level of moisture in the fuel? For this experiment, we collected 4 leaf types, senescent leaf material from Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, longleaf pine, and southern red oak. We also introduced 2 controls in here that were untreated cut pine boards and fabric mesh, because we wanted to be able to tilt the samples relative to the scanner to see the impact of angle. And we couldn't effectively, of course, be tilting trays full of leaf material. We also had 2 scanners, a Faro S350, which is a phase shift LiDAR unit, and a Regal VZ2000, which is a time of flight LiDAR units. Both of these operated using 1550 nanometer laser light. Here is a table here describing the types of the sample types, the scan intervals. We were scanning at 0, 2 hours, 4 hours, 8 hours, 12 hours, 36 hours, basically to capture that gradient as the materials dried. Once the materials no longer had a substantive change in their sample weights, indicating that they had really reached moisture content matching the relative humidity, they were put into drying ovens. We had each sample was scanned at 3 meters, 6 meters, 9 meters, and 12 meters, and we had separate scans at different angles for our 2 control types. Altogether, this meant that we had 5,120 scans of vegetation samples and 7,296 scans of our controls, totaling 12,416 total samples. There were a few that we had to throw out because of data corruption, but we were still in that ballpark, about 12,000 samples. So looking at our first question, relating the fuel moisture content specifically to reflectance measured by a spectrometer, we used an ASD field spectrometer 4. We sampled and created spectral signatures for the entire width of the sample range for the spectrometer. And here are the different sample types of vegetation types: the Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, longleaf pine, southern red oak, fabric mesh, and pine boards. Where you can see the darker blue lines are those fully saturated samples, lightening up to the white, which is the oven dried samples. And here's an image of our spectrometer setup. We were sampling approximately the center 9 centimeters of each sample. Careful to ensure that the sample area was fully covered with our plant material and there was no mesh or the bottom of the trays showing through. Plotting out the data only at 1550 nanometers, the reflectance values from the spectrometer, we see a very strong relationship between the spectral reflectance and the moisture content as they dried. The conifer needles all tend to have a similar curve, with the southern red oak, pine board, and fabric mesh having different relationships with that reflectance as they dried. A terrestrial LiDAR setup is as noted before, both LiDAR units operated at 1550 nanometers. Here are images of the 2 scanners we used: the Faro phase shift and the Regal time of flight. What's important here is just how they operated. The Faro, as a phase shift unit, will emit a continuous beam of light with modulated wavelengths associated with that, that continuous emittance. And when it receives reflectance back off of whatever material, it looks at that shift in the waveform to gauge distance traveled. The Regal, as a time of flight, is a more what we more classically think of when we think of LiDAR. It emits a pulse, it's reflected off something, and at times how long it takes for that pulse energy to return, divides it by 2, and with using, of course, the speed of light. These scans, we were trying to keep them as short as possible, so about 3.5 minutes. This whole sample, this design was because we were trying to minimize the time of the samples and the rotation of the samples to ensure that materials weren't drying mid-data collection. So from our scanners, the number of pulses per sample varied greatly, of course, depending on the distance from scanner. The Regal scanner had upwards of 100,000 pulses per sample tray at 3 meters, which was, the sample trays were, of course, about 30 centimeters square, where the Faro had less returns per sample tray, but still upwards of about 30,000 at the 3 meters, decreasing to about 900 for the Faro at 12 meters. So the number of pulses that we were averaging and creating these metrics from were typically were several thousand per single sample. We looked at the mean, median, 95th percentile, standard deviation, variance, and skew of pulses per sample. Generally, the mean of all pulses performed the best in looking for those relationships, with the standard deviation also performing very well. Here is a plot of the Faro in black, Regal in green. It has the regression lines added to it, looking at the change in the mean intensity values in relationship to the moisture content. We looked at simple linear regression, some transformation of the data, but for the individual variables, a broken stick linear regression performed the best. With that break right around 100% moisture content, there seemed to be somewhat of an inflection point for the samples, the exception being the pine board. But the standard deviation it was interesting initially, because looking at these other images here of the fully saturated with water, 30% moisture content, oven dried samples as a pine board, you can see that not only does the reflectance increase as it dries out, but the image itself becomes more homogeneous in its appearance, accounting for that relationship with the standard deviation. Here are the plots for the standard deviation and the mean intensity values. And while these both have performed fairly well to model that relationship, the best models were actually formed when using the mean and standard deviation in a multiple linear regression. Visualizing that, here's a three-dimensional plot looking at the standard deviation, the mean intensity values in relationship to that moisture percent. When we combined these two variables together, we were getting R-squared values all the way up to 0.98 for that relationship between the LiDAR intensity returns and fuel moisture. Also, when isolating, the distance is, so only looking at 3 meters, only looking at 6 meters, that relationship increased, with highest relationships being closest to the scanner. When we clumped all of them together, that relationship decreased again as well, and as well as the materials mattered as well. We looked at all of the regression values for all of our different tests. Here's a short summary table looking at the R-squared values for our vegetation as well as our controls, the fabric mesh and the pine board. The highlighted in red is the R-squared values for the vegetation samples at 3 meters using the intensity mean and the standard deviation. We see that, you know, the Regal typically performed better than the Faro even at close range. We also see, if you look at here, that the relationship degraded much faster for the Faro, the phase shift scanner. The time of flight scanner, the Regal, had a more consistent relationship modeling fuel moisture using the mean and standard deviation, even when looking at all of the distances values combined. The one exception here that was really hard to model was the pine board. We never really got extremely high R-squared values when modeling the pine board, just indicating that, to me, that the things like if there were knots presence or different grain patterns really had an impact in that reflectance value. So looking at the control samples and trying to determine what impacts the effect angle had on these relationships, we do see that as the boards were tilted from 0 degrees being, you know, flat on the ground, 45 degrees, and 90 degrees being standing upright, we do see that the energy increases as that angle relative to the scanner becomes more and more, you know, perpendicular to the scanner. These plots, this figure here is that the black is a 1-to-1 line relationship with the mean intensity values of the samples when they're flat on the ground, 0 degrees. And so that the 45 degree and 90 degree like plots are above that higher intensity value indicates that they were more reflective, sending more energy back to the scanner, which intuitively makes sense, as we know that as angle has a huge impact on the amount of energy returned from any sort of emittance. The pine board, once again, had a much greater change in that relationship. As the regression lines, if the regression lines stay perpendicular to that 1-to-1 line, that relationship, the coefficients, doesn't really change. What we see with the pine board, those regression lines really start deviating from a parallel, indicating that while the fabric mesh, the coefficients in the relationship stay pretty similar to regardless of the angle had a really high impact on the relationship with the pine boards. So revisiting our initial questions, is there a relationship between spectral reflectance from a spectrometer and moisture content? Yes. Is there a relationship between fuel moisture and LiDAR intensity returns? Yes. Is there a difference in the relationship between if a time of flight or a phase shift scanner is used? Yes, there is a difference. The difference was pretty negligible at close distances, but further from the scanners, the time of flight started outperforming the phase shift. Does the distance and angle of the LiDAR pulse relative to the sample change the relationship? Yes, it does. Once again, however, less with the time of flights. And does the type of fuel change that relationship? Yes. Conifer needles tend to stay the same, but like the fabric mesh and pine boards had a very different relationship. So the conclusions. Lasers can be used to quantify change in moisture. Mixed fuel beds will, of course, have a greater challenge than these pure samples that we were using. The next step for this study is to take it out of the laboratory, out into the field, and to start trying to develop and create fuel gradient maps of areas from terrestrial LiDAR scans. And as a last image, here are the sample types, fully saturated and fully dried, one of the 16 trays. All right, well, thank you very much.
Great talk, Jonathan. We have time for a few questions if anyone has one. Please feel free to put it in the chat, or you can just hop on and ask it directly through Zoom.
This is Susan. I had one and I just put it in the chat, but it's easier to just get on video. Thanks so much for the presentation, Jonathan. It was great. So I wanted to get a sense for how much correlation you found between the mean and standard deviations, because you put both variables in your predictive models of fuel moisture.
Yeah, there wasn't actually much of any correlation. We did test for correlation, and of course the mean, the 95th percentile, and the median were all highly correlated, and the variance and standard deviation, of course, were highly correlated. But the mean and standard deviation were not correlated, because it really is a question of how much variability was present. And it's really obvious, I felt, with like the pine boards especially, because with that grain really popping out in the intensity images, you can see that variation in the sample.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, Jonathan, to follow up on that, evaluating what you've seen with the fuel moisture and now looking at, tens of thousands, 12,000 samples, how do you think it will play out when you start mixing multiple fuel types into would that be a next phase with this? You talk about going out in the field, but would it make sense to start looking initially at maybe mixing up like making a mixed fuel bed to see what that variation is?
Yeah, I think if the mixture, I guess, is somewhat consistent across an area, that would probably, depending on the sample size or sort of a grid pattern you would lay, I think it's definitely possible to have create like moisture gradient maps controlling from distance from scanner. But if you have a full sample site or selection that is a wholly different type of material, that would be harder to tease that out. We're still a bit of a way from actually figuring out how to, shoot a laser at something and have a digital display saying how much moisture is there. But this is, I think, a very important first step in realizing how we can utilize TLS, like the intensity values, beyond just the positional information. And there have been similar studies using intensity values, looking at things like moisture content of a cut timber or building materials, or the health of leaves because it's near infrared. But I think this is the first one I've seen that's tried to leverage this ability on actual like potential fire fuels in the forest.
Very cool. Well, thank you. This has been a great session, and now I will pass it back to our producer so she can offer us some closing announcements. And thank you all for participating in this special session.
Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you to all of our speakers for sharing your expertise with us today. This session will be available in Whova within 2 weeks after the Congress ends. Up next, we have a 20-minute break before our last set of breakouts begin. We have 2 special session breakouts, a general session, and a safe meeting and trivia networking session, all beginning at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. To choose the one you'd like to join, use the agenda tab to the left of your screen and click sessions. You can also click sub-sessions for more details about what to expect. To join the session offering Spanish and Portuguese interpretation, be sure to select the session titled Actions for Sustaining Biodiversity in Fire-Prone Ecosystems. Thanks again to our speakers and enjoy the rest of your day.